Hi guys, welcome back to Legal Risk Evaluation and Systems, and we are up to week 8, and week 8 deals with contractual risk. There's not a whole lot we really need to labour the point about in this particular week. I mean, from your degree studies, we're all lawyers, we know how important contracts are and getting drafting right is. To some extent, we're kind of preaching to the converted here amongst us in outlining, the importance and the business sense in taking the time to get your contracts right. However, when you get out into the real world and you see what actually goes on in the marketplace, you will very rapidly discover that many business people and organisations, in fact, some would hazard a guess and say most business people and organisations, do not put the same level of importance upon contractual relations that lawyers do. And you'll see that often there is no contract, there's no actual terms and conditions that have been set out in writing to govern the relationship between the parties. So it can be a matter of skill somewhat in working out exactly what it is that's been bargained for. And this is the situation that you don't want to end up in, obviously, from a risk perspective. I think the really interesting thing is that the viewpoint that we hold as lawyers, that is, everything needs to be set out in writing and tied up with a nice, neat bow so that everyone has contractual certainty. And the business perspective of, let's just get the deal done. I've known Joe for 20 years. We're all good for this. We know what we're bargaining for. Let's just do it on a handshake. It's kind of interesting to see how these are quite polarised views. And we tend to think that our view as lawyer is inherently right, because it usually is. And yet, the business people obviously think that their way is the best way forward. It's the way to get the deal done the quickest. And often, that is just the accepted way of doing things. It's interesting to see how polar these viewpoints are. Certainly our legal training pushes us down the path of contractual certainty, and that's the way that the legal risk evaluation exercise proceeds. The more contractual certainty, the better. It's the reason why Whaley and Gazillion go through their 7-step contractual cycle to break everything down nicely into bite-sized pieces to make sure that you get each step in the contracting process right and that it flows on logically to the next one. That's all good, and I'll leave you to explore the text on your own. What I did want to throw out there for your consideration is some work, very seminal work, done quite some time ago by Stuart Macaulay and Ian McNeill. And they explored the whole idea of what came to be called relational contracting. And here I have Macaulay's seminal work from 1963, which caused a real stir in the scholarship of contracts, because essentially he did an empirical study, well, several, into the way that business people actually contract with each other out there in the real world. And he found a huge variance to, not surprisingly, to the way that lawyers would dictate things should be done. And some hailed it as, the death of contract law, and the naysayers said that it was a storm in a teacup. And I don't think either extreme view on Macaulay's work has, taken a whole lot of traction. But what it does show us is that there can be a happy medium between that, very black letter approach to getting the deal done and getting the T's and C's right, and having no contract at all. So while Macaulay's study indicated that quite often there was actually no T's and C's, he found that there was quite a number of constraining factors around the parties' relationship and their performance of their contract that served to all guide it down the path of a successful conclusion. And one of these, probably the biggest reason why the parties felt that an actual written contract wasn't necessary, was that they'd spent so much time negotiating exactly what each party's primary obligations were. Everyone was clear about what they wanted out of the contract. Everyone knew what they had to do in terms of achieving the contract outputs. And so therefore there was very little room for what he calls honest misunderstandings about that kind of fundamental issue, the bedrock of the contract itself. He also found there were a couple of other things. Products were often standardised in their description, so everyone knew what everybody else was talking about. There was always, pretty much a leeway given for tolerances in results. Everyone knows production's not perfect, and so both of the parties knew that there had to be some wriggle room there. Customs, they also found, often stepped in to fill any gaps in the understandings between the parties and dictated how the relationship would proceed in an unexpected contingency. Tests were usually allowed prior to acceptance, so everyone was happy with what they were getting. Defaults, he found, were not terribly disastrous, because you could do a couple of things. You could use risk avoidance measures, so you could make sure that you're always dealing with parties you know or parties who have a good reputation, or you could engage in risk spreading. So you could insure yourself against the other party not performing or you not getting what you want. He found there were quite effective non-legal sanctions that again constrained the parties' performance. One big one was ethics. So we've already spent pretty much most of last week talking about ethics. No welshing on a deal. Product pride, so you always stand behind your product. And the two big ones really were that the parties would always work to preserve their relationship, their business relationship. The prospect of an ongoing relationship and further contractual relations between the parties was a big incentive to do the right thing, so to speak, and also to preserve your business reputation. So not just with the other party that you're actually contracting with, but to other parties in the marketplace. Now, all of those things, Macaulay found, served to dictate to the business people that contracts, actual written terms weren't so important. It really was the spirit of what was agreed between the parties. Now, you might say, well, that's all very good for 1963. Things might have been done on a handshake then. What about now? Well, I can tell you, out in the marketplace, this stuff still goes on. What is intriguing, I guess, for our purposes is the way that Macaulay's findings about what really goes on between business people has morphed into the way that we look at contracts. And McNeil kind of picked up the relational contracting ball and ran with it and developed the idea insofar as American contractual scholarship is concerned. And I'll just take you to McNeil's work. And he, in this article, I've put both of these articles up for anybody that has the time or interest to have a little look at them. But McNeil in this article traces the way that relational contracting has kind of crept into the way that we think about contracts. And if you think about relationships between parties, you can see, for example, as I've got here, the American Restatement of Contracts had introduced concepts like unconscionability, duress, good faith, best efforts, all of these kinds of fuzzy conceptual notions that attempt to give some life to what happens out there in the marketplace between people, the relational aspects of what happens between people. And I think it's a good time for us to pause and reflect on our practice as lawyers. Sure, we need to engage in the whole risk evaluation process. We need to do our risk assessments. We need to make sure our organisations' contracts will stand up to scrutiny. But in terms of deploying those contracts and ensuring that you're getting the most out of those contracts, I think Whaley and Gazzellian touch on it. They say you've got to make sure there's no bottom drawer mentality, and that is keep the contract up on your desk, keep its requirements first in mind. And I would probably take that one step further and say make sure that you're intimately familiar with the spirit of the contract, and particularly for line managers and the operational people that are putting the contractual terms into effect at the coalface, they are the ones that really need to be convinced that the spirit of the contract is working for the organisation, that they are able to achieve that, and that things progress in the way that's expected. I guess the whole point of bringing Macaulay's work and McNeil's work to your attention is just to give you a bit of food for thought. Quite often we as lawyers can get so focused on the black letter side of contracting that we tend to lose sight of why the contract is being put in place in the first instance, and that is to cement a relationship, to guide a relationship. And if that's what we have in mind, then hopefully, whether we're in-house counsel or we're in an in-house legal department, or whether we're advising clients, we're less likely to be seen as obstructive in holding the whole process up, and we're more likely to be seen as facilitating the contractual process occurring. If we have in mind that things proceed, the business's operations proceed, the contract relationship proceeds from that interpersonal relationship between the parties, then we get our perspective right. We can manage to see that the deal is first and foremost, and if we have to give a bit there in terms of keeping the other party happy, or take a bit here in terms of perhaps expecting a bit less for our organisation than we originally wanted, it's about the give and the take, and it's about getting that contract across the line. Sure, that contract is really important for our risk purposes, but it's just a guide, and the contract will serve really to simply sit underneath what is probably the most important thing, and that is the relationship between the parties. Anyway, I hope that was food for thought. If you have any queries and questions, as I always say, please just drop me an email or post a comment in the forums. Other than that, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, like and subscribe. And hopefully I'll get a chance to talk with you in an upcoming Zoom session. Other than that, thanks for watching. Bye, guys.